gradually they'll colour up throughout the season, and then by about the autumn point, the colour will become fully intense. And it's at this stage that we just have to pick the odd grape and taste them just to see if the flavour is right, to know when they're ready to pick. Hi, welcome to WeSow, and in today's episode we're going to talk to you about how to grow your own grapes. Now, it's been a while since we last released a video, and that's because we've had some technical issues, and the technical issues have even affected the video which we have for you today, in the sense that the latter portion of the video will be going outside. However, I've had to re-record the original first portion of the video, which is why I'm here indoors. Nonetheless, let's begin as we go on this journey. The all-important question that I've been asked many times from people is, can grapes really grow well in the UK? And the short answer is yes, and they can grow surprisingly well. The variety of grape that we grow in our garden is known as a Barbera, and this is an Italian red wine grape, and it's also a really good table grape, which is what we use ours for, just to simply eat for enjoyment. Now, the important thing to consider as the first point of call when growing grapes is the age of the grapevine. Now, usually you can pick up grapevines in garden centres, and it's important to find out the age of the vine. Oftentimes the seller may have that information as part of the original packaging. And the reason that's important is because grapevines usually only start producing fruit once they are 3 years old. So depending on how old the grapevine is, that will determine how long you may have to wait before you start to see fruit. So if you have a grapevine, if it's too young, then you may have to wait longer. But if it is at least 3 years old, then you can be confident that the grapevine will be able to bear fruit sooner rather than later. Once you have chosen a grapevine, the important thing to consider is the growing site. And this is important because there are two main things to think about when choosing where to position your grapevine. Firstly, pick a site that gets plenty of sunlight, because your grapevine is going to need this in order to flourish and also to ripen any fruit that it is growing. The second consideration of the site is the use of a trellis. And a trellis is just a structure that the grapevine will attach itself to. And this is important because grapevines, they send out tendrils which search for and wrap around any structure that they can in order to anchor the vine and to secure the vine in its place. Now, in our case, with our grapevine, we have a site which is in good sunlight. However, our vine is potted. Now, normally grapevines, when you plant them into the ground, they can send their roots quite deep and quite far, and it can get to the point where it can be impossible to remove them if you ever wanted to without the plant, for example, dying. So in our case, what we specifically did was we potted ours, but we buried our pot in the ground. And what that does is it makes the vine look as though it's in its permanent place. However, if we ever were to move, for example, we'd be able to take it with us. In the case of our trellis, we simply got some old fence panel, which is kind of like a checkered set of fence panel, like the top part of it, which has some short sections of wood which go across in a checkered fashion. And we have this positioned behind the grapevine so that it can attach itself in place. Now, the important thing to consider as well with the fact that the vine is potted in our case is nutrients, but we will get onto that in a later part of the video. Once you've got your grapevine growing in its correct growing site, the next important consideration in order to get a good yield of grapes is the pruning. Now, when we grow a grapevine, there's a structure which facilitates how we are going to prune. And this structure tends to be where we have a main stem, and then from the main stem, we tend to have two main branches. Usually they fan out like this, but not always, as is the case with our one. But the main thing is to just have that structure where you have these two branches which come off the main stem. And this is important because grapevines only fruit on 1-year-old wood. So the stem and the two branches act as the main structure, whereas any side shoots that come on these two main branches will constitute where we produce fruit. And it's from these side shoots that we will be doing the pruning in order to keep the wood a year old and not to allow our grapevine to become overrun with lots of old wood that produces less and less fruit. Now, the way we tend to do this is to, in the first year, just let your grapevine grow, let it get established on its trellis. And then towards the end of the season, once all the leaves have fallen off, you will find that there will be these things known as nodes. And these nodes are like these bump-like structures which will be on the branches that have grown during that season. And these branches will become your 1-year-old wood for next year. So if you imagine you have a side shoot which has 10 nodes on it, what you want to do is you want to cut that side shoot from 10 nodes down to about 2 nodes. And so once you have done that, you know that that shoot for the following year, you're going to have the new growth that comes out of the nodes. So you'll have 2 sets of new growth coming out of that node on that branch, which will be a year old in the following year. And then next year, what you would do is repeat the process, except that you would look at that 1-year-old vine that had produced 2 new vines during the season that fruited. If you imagine those 2 vines have come off, you cut that main structure down so that you've lost 1 vine, and then you have 1 vine left, and you then cut that down to 2 nodes, and you repeat the process. And that's an important key that contributes to having a good yield of grapes. The pruning which we've just described is generally done during the colder months of the season. So it's important once we have done the pruning to understand what we will be looking for once spring arrives. Once spring arrives, what we will notice is that the vines will emerge from the nodes, and the vines will have leaves, but they will also have these long tendrils, which are these rope-like extensions, which will wrap around the trellis or whatever support they manage to find. But then also you have to look out for the actual grape flowers, which look like these little bumpy bits which are near to the tendrils at first. And then they start to look like little grape clusters, but they're actually flowers at this stage. And what they will have are these extensions on them, which are like these kind of filament type things. And you will find that the pollen will start to develop on them as they fertilize. And then these flowers will start to swell into the actual grape clusters. And so they will just look like bigger versions of what they had started out as. And if they are a variety like a red grape variety, they'll start out green and then gradually they'll color up throughout the season. And then by about the autumn point, the color will become fully intense. And it's at this stage that we just have to pick the odd grape and taste them just to see if the flavor is right, to know when they're ready to pick. The other major consideration is nutrients. Now, usually when grapevines are planted, they tend to be planted in the soil, and the roots go very deep and very far, to the extent that it can be almost impossible to remove, which is why we have ours in a pot. With that in mind, however, it's important to fertilize in the spring, especially if they're in a pot or if that pot is actually underground, as in our case, because there's less nutrients. But either way, it's still really important to fertilize. Now, we've used things such as rock dust, which didn't do much in terms of yield, but then we switched to liquid fertilizer, which somebody encouraged us to do, and it was a high potash fertilizer, organic formula, and things such as a liquid tomato feed can do the trick. And what we found was that we got more fruiting vines, and as a result we went from having at most 6 grape clusters to about 17 as what we have this year. And as you can see, there's quite a good amount of grapes in here, about 17 as we've counted, as I mentioned. And the importance of doing that fertilizing in the spring of the high potash, which is high in potassium, I think a good amount of phosphorus as well, is that you'll get that formation of more grape clusters. And so that's an important key when we are looking for higher yields of grapes. Thanks so much for watching. Do remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video. Take care. Bye.